No, Chicago.
Chicago.
Chicago, where I saw this talk, and it blew my tiny little mind. Because I do a lot of UI testing, and I like UI testing, and I'm interested in API testing. And just the way that you brought it across, I said that's a talk that we definitely want to have here. And I'm glad that we made it. It was a bit difficult, but it worked. Thank you for being here, and thanks for giving the talk.
Thank you so much for having me here and giving me this opportunity. Yeah, I hope everyone would be happy after this talk also. So yeah, hi, I'm Shivani, and I work in XING here in Hamburg in Germany itself. I'm a senior QA there, and I'm working since last 6 years in testing domain. And I've experience of almost all domains of testing like UI, API, database, but API testing is my favorite, and that's what I'm going to share with you today, my journey of moving from UI to API testing. And I'm always available and up for discussions over XING, LinkedIn, Twitter, and even on beer tables. So true, catch me afterwards. Yeah, so basically I love traveling world, meeting new people like you all here, and I love eating food, shows very well. Yeah, and I love ice creams. Do you love ice creams? Yeah? So ice creams have actually played a very important role in my onboarding for API testing. Earlier, I was working in projects and I was always doing majorly UI testing, and whenever there was a new feature, I was focusing on how I can test it on the UI level, playing around how the user can do it and stuff like that. And then one of my dev was continuously noticing my testing activities, and he told me that, Shivani, you know, you can test on other layers except for UI. And I didn't really know what he meant. I was like, what do you mean? So he took me to an ice cream parlor, and we were eating this ice cream. It was very tasty, and that ice cream made my day. And when we were having this ice cream, he asked me, Shivani, how would you test this ice cream? And I looked at the ice cream and I said, yeah, it's pretty easy. I would test if the waffle is crispy enough, if the flavors are the one that I wanted, if it's not too sweet, if the toppings are correct, and I went on and on and on. And he said, wait, now what you are testing is the final product that a person sees, that a user would see, that is in your hand. You are testing majorly from a UI perspective. Could you think of the ways that you can test beyond this or even at before levels? And I was like, yeah, maybe I can test if the waiter took correct order, if he went to the kitchen and put the correct flavors that I wanted, if he put the right waffle, or even one step before of if the waffle was baked for the correct time, if the correct amount of sugar was added in the ice cream flavors. And then he was like, exactly, that's what I meant. This is what you can also do with your software. And I was like, wow, that sounds interesting, implying ice cream phenomena to my software. But how does this work? Like, what's behind my software? I don't know. And he explained me with something like this. He said, what happens is, so you are basically going to ice cream parlor, you order, and the waiter comes, he takes your order, he goes to the kitchen, prepares some stuff, and comes back with your order. A similar kind of thing happens in our system. We have a client, for example, in our case it was UI, and then when I'm doing something like maybe creating a user, I make an API request to the server where all the calculations happen, and from the server, an API response is made to the client, and client reacts accordingly. I was like, wow, so seems like all the logic is lying in the API layer then. Mostly things are getting there. So I should start doing API testing. And I asked my dev that maybe he could help me here and provide a sample. So I said, maybe give me a API to create a user like I do from UI. So he said, yeah. And he gave me this and he said, yeah, just write this curl command on your terminal and you will get a user created. And I was like this, oh no, 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 no. This is not what I can work with. I am not a technical person. I wasn't at that time. I was so touched and interacted with my UI and fancy buttons and how user thinks that it was too difficult for me to understand this curl command. So what we realized was we need a change in perspective. I want to do API testing, yes, but still I want to look through it from a glasses of a UI tester. So we thought, okay, there might be tools around that could help me in doing this. So we researched a bit. We look around tools. There was JMeter, Karate, Postman, and we chose Postman. How many of you work with Postman? Okay, good. So for those who don't work with Postman, it's a tool with which you can play around with API, do API testing, and it has some very good benefits, like it's open source up to some extent, and then it's easy to install and set up. It's very easy to configure and then test on Postman, and you can do every test on the fly, like in seconds, and it offers a UI-like feeling. For me, the major part why I chose Postman was it was very user-friendly again, in that you have buttons and you can really split up your curl command in a way that a non-technical tester like me would also understand. So that time I was working with a financial application, and it used to look something like this. So we had, you can fill up your personal information, then your contact data, your phone numbers, your address, and then your financial data like your contracts details and so on, and then afterwards you get a loan. And this was the UI part. So how it looked in Postman was like this. So all the data that I want to give for creating a application, I can give in just one post call. Like you can see, it's all the usernames and like its personal details, then their employment details, and then their financial details and so on. And then the user is created. What I realized is that on UI that we don't notice, we need to notice on API that it's a two-step form. Like in the ice cream, we had a request of giving the ice cream and a response of taking that ice cream. Here also we had a request of creating, and then we also need to focus on the response that the user is created well. So basically, this is how I got onboarded to API testing. This was my basic story. But with time, I realized that this is not just one thing like we see here as request and response. API consists of a lot of things, a lot of small parameters that we can take into account, and we should not forget about developing them or while testing them. And those were endpoint, method, body, request response headers, authorization, code, and execution time. So these are the major parameters that I keep in mind while I'm testing, and when we are grooming some API tickets and developing them, I plan with my devs to focus on this. And to make this a concrete and set up in my mind, I took first letter from all of them and formed embrace. So I embrace my APIs. And this is what I would like to discuss in the rest of the talk. I would go through each of the points and tell you some tips, some bugs that I found in each of them, and how we pair up and how we do test on each of the segments. E, endpoint. So when I ordered this ice cream, the waiter had to go to some kitchen to get the ice cream, and this is what endpoint is. This is what I relate to. So it's the kitchen where the waiter goes to get the ice cream. And to understand endpoint, it's important that we understand a URI. So a URI is something like this. So you have first a protocol, which could be HTTPS, HTTP, FTP, and so on. Then you have a host, Host is basically like a server where your things are lying. So host could be like example.com, eclipseconf.com, localhost.com, joy doesn't share food.com. Then we have endpoint. So endpoint is basically the variable part here that we majorly focus on API testing. It's like /rest users to create user, maybe /rest payments for payments. And for example, once I noticed that one of our endpoint was not following a convention and it was named as a rest account and not accounts. So these kind of small things also we can contribute. And then there's a query parameter which helps us filtering. So for example, this is a URI to for a user, and then with this query parameter I can filter out a user which is having an email of Shivani@xing.com. And what we also focus is in our team is testing different values for this query parameter of what if it's an empty one, what happens if it's invalid, what happens if it's valid. And we also try to write unit test level, we try to cover all of them on the unit test level pairing up with devs. Just a small snippet, for example, we had pages type parameter, and not only we wrote for 200 code like when the pages type is okay, but also what if I don't provide this parameter, or if I provide invalid values for these parameters. So we also wrote unit tests for this, and this helps us developing good APIs then. M, method. So when we go to this ice cream parlor, we have certain actions that we can do, like we can give the order, we can update the order, or we can tell waiter, no, we don't want it, we want to cancel the order. So similar things happen in our application systems. So we have different methods, like on UI we see different buttons, right? That there's maybe a create button to create something, update button, delete button, and there's so many functionalities that happen on UI. But how does this happen then when I click on create button and the user is getting created in the database? How? What is the magic? There are some API methods that do this magic. So these are the most common ones that I mentioned here. So posts helps us create something, patch helps us update the resource, get helps us read to get the value of the resource, and delete helps us deleting this resource. So these there are a lot more, but I focused on these because these are most common used. And thinking of these methods remind me of a very funny incident that happened with me. So my manager, we were once having a bug in production that users were not able to update their data correctly. So my manager said, Shivani, we need to test updating of data all correctly. And what I did was on the UI, there were certain tabs like I showed earlier. We were fulfilling all the application, like filling 3 steps forms, and then updating, for example, phone number, and then I have to fill the 3-step, like 4-step form again, and then update something else. And it was too much work for me, and I was literally banging my head on the laptop like, oh no, it's so time consuming. And then my dev reminded that, remember about API magic? You can use that for testing of updates. So, oh, sorry, I thought I pressed. So now I'm banging my head again. Yeah, so then he told me that we can use our API magic again here. So let's suppose I want to create a user and update his employment details from employed to unemployed. So with some simple steps I could really do it. So first was, with the post method I can create a user who is employed. Then I can check with the get method if the user that I created is actually correctly created with correct details. Then I can, with the step 3, I can use a patch method to update the details to have him unemployed. and then again check with the get method that if now the status has changed from employed to unemployed. And even not even 4 steps, if I collect them all in one collection, it would be just one step for me to test, and this would be then very time saving. So I realized that APIs are much quicker, and not even in manual testing, even in automation testing, we started removing all the test data creation that was happening from UI and replaced them from the API level, and then our tests were really fast. B, body. So this was again the application that we were having that time, and all the data that was there. Here is the body, for example, of user creation, and also when the user is created, we get a response body with the user ID. So we can do multiple checks here. We can play around with the parameters that are given the response body on the API level itself. And I have a request body cheat sheet for this. So what we can check on UI level, we can also check on API level. For example, let's suppose we have only 2 fields in our form, email and phone number, and both are mandatory. So if I have this on UI, what can I check? I can check giving the valid data. I can check giving the invalid data, like email is missing the format, it's incorrect format. And I can check with the empty field, like the phone number, which is mandatory, is missing. But there's a lot more that we can test on the API level, which possibly we couldn't at the UI level. For example, I can check missing of the mandatory fields, like what if the phone number field itself is gone from the JSON file? What if I check with client prohibited value, like on UI sometimes when you have a phone number which accepts integer, we cannot type ABC or some string in it, but with the API level you can do that and check what happens. You can check the malform format, like what if it's a JSON broken JSON. And even more, going one step further, we can check what if the format is invalid. What if I try doing some security testing with SQL injections, giving some parameters to email or something like that. But none of this testing would be useful for us if we don't see what happens in the response. So what is major for us is also find out if the response is correct, and talk to the devs and QA and devs pair up to see what happens in which case. Am I okay with the speed? Too fast? Too slow? Catching up? Cool. R, request response headers. Basically, when we order this ice cream to the waiter, he writes something on paper, like he makes his own notes what we want. So this is not the order itself, it's the information about the order. And headers are something similar. They are like an envelope of the letter which has the metadata of the data itself. Usually, like we have headers in request and in response, and usually they talk about response body and authorization, and in request body and request authorization, and in response it's mostly about cookies and cache and authorization itself. So we generally tend to forget about testing these headers because they don't seem important to us and we don't focus a lot of them. But this is one crucial part of API we should focus on, because there could be bugs, like we can maybe leak security information which we shouldn't in these kind of headers. So we should always focus on headers also. A, authorization. Does everyone here carry smartphones? Do you have cell phones? Alex has. So what do you use for their security? Do you use, how many of you use PIN codes like 1, 2, 3, 4? Good. How many of you use patterns like the patterns? How many of you use biometrics? And nice. Oh, you have double locks. Cool. Very secure. And how many of you don't use any of the security locks? See, everyone is very smart here. Smart people, smartphones. So our APIs also need to be smart, right? So there are also authorization in API. So no one can really access it without our permissions. So there are different kinds of authorizations like basic auth, OAuth, and so on. I won't go in details. So basically, what we need to focus here is, for example, if the waiter doesn't have the key for the kitchen, we would deny the access, right? So similar thing should happen here. Like if I don't provide any access, then there should be a error message saying that okay, you are not authenticated, and there should be also in the body some error message that you're not authenticated, but we should not reveal deeper details like why we are not authenticated, because that could be a security issue then. So, and now talking about this like authorization, and we should give errors in doing that. We might think, right, that this was an API talk. Why do I talk about security? How can we contribute there? So even though we are not security expert, if we look at the like, why do we do this? You see, there are even the very famous companies like Google and Shopify, they had API flaws. And we all, being not even security expert, being functional testers or developers, we can really contribute to testing of APIs security also. And there are some quick checks that I would always suggest, and I always do. Authorization, like checking with wrong username password, with incorrect password itself, with correct ones, trying with the deleted ones which were existing before, and so on. Trying authentication, like if you have different users category like admin and basic users. So basic cannot do what admin only admin has the right to do, so we should have restrictions there. And not only check that if if the authorization is working fine, but also checking the whole response, like if it's not revealing any details which would help user to crack our system. And also tokens. So with tokens, I have found a bug once that we were preparing a new API, we were developing a new API which were having tokens which were expiring in 5 minutes, which should expire in 5 minutes. But then I realized that they were not expiring at all. When I was testing, I was like, wow. And anyone could basically brute force this, because what's a token? It's just a string. And anyone can enter the random string and try to brute force our system, and then they can have all the details they want. So basically, I found this bug, and even with a small security mindset, we were able to catch this. C, code. So when I give this order to the waiter for the ice cream, he either comes with the ice cream and says, hey, this is your order, what you wanted, it's successful, or might say, sorry, it's not available in our in our parlor anymore, it's out of stock. Or maybe they can say that, hey, this doesn't exist in the menu at all. So there are certain codes there are certain responses that we get from the waiter. And similar thing happens in API. And when we make a request, in the response we get some codes. So in 100s it's informational, in 200s it's success, in 300s it's redirection, 400s it's client errors, and 500s it's server error. So for every case we will get one of these, and we are very sure what is happening then. For example, here I have, if I press users instead of user, it says, sorry, this does not exist, it's 404 not found. And for example, if I make my service down for some time and try to access my URL, it says, sorry, this is unavailable at the moment. But if focus, yes, we did understand that we should have these response code, but if we focus only on API this time and not see how our UI responses on these codes, then we might end up in something like this, seeing on a train station like, sorry, yes, the API code was correct, but the UI doesn't know how to handle it. So we should also try to test and integrate them. Another interesting thing that I find regarding this is that how we can use these codes to help create good bug reports. For example, I now work with XING, and it's a social networking site, and there's also a section where you have news and you have different articles there. So it's a short demo. So you have different articles and where you can have different social interactions like, comment, share. And I once noticed that once I was typing a comment, it was, sorry, there's something wrong in it. And as a curious tester who sees this bug, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna open this bug report with my 3 favorite words of a tester. What are they? That is strange. It doesn't work. True. So as a tester, I'm always like, yeah, this is not working, that is not working. But what could be interesting for us and for the team and would be that I tell why it doesn't work. So we can have a look at the console and say, okay, this error is reproducible every time. And then there's a code 500 saying internal server error. And I can add the screenshot to the ticket. Or even more, going in details, I can see that here are the logs formed, for example, and I go to this controller and see what the logs are and be like a detective. And trust me, if we do this, our devs would be so happy and devs and QA would be best friends forever. E, execution time. You all got curious, right? So it was not that long that it took. It was just few seconds silence, right? But it's 2019 and we all are so impatient. We want to do things like, so we need to implement this in our API side also, because our users won't wait 30 seconds even for logging in. They won't. So after testing the functional part, if it's correct or not, we should not forget to focus on if it's working in the correct time or not. And this is a very good point where devs and QAs can really pair up to see if it's correct, if it's optimal execution time for this API. And sometimes there are even chains of APIs. So you do an action, it's not one, but the chain of APIs, and then which API is the slowest one. So we need to figure it out this way also. After learning about so much about API testing, like their APIs are fast, they have most logic, they are very reliable, they don't change that often, and so on and so on. So there are so many benefits of APIs. So should I just stop UI testing? Exactly, no. Why do we want to use swords to stitch clothes? Why do you want to use swords to stitch clothes? There are small things for that called needles, right? So that's the way. If you want to do some checks for the user interface, checking them on different browsers or how good it is or how user friendly it is, we have to do UI testing. They both go in complementary to each other, not contradictory to each other. And actually, this is the way I think we should do the UI testing. So there is a client which talks to the API, and instead of talking to the real API, we should mock the API and test how our client reacts. Because we can configure the mock APIs as we want, we can give them any codes, and they would be super fast and reliable. So this is how I prefer and suggest to do the client testing. yeah, with this, I would just wind up, and before I leave, I have a little secret that made my life really easy, especially for API testing, and this was documentation. So we do documentation in Swagger, and we are continuously maintaining them. Our developers are doing it on timely basis. Whenever we change something, we update it here. There's a quick demo that I can show. So for example, it has all the APIs listed, all the endpoints that could be handled. For example, for comments, we have all the parameters that are there, what response codes can we get, and it's even linked to an environment where I can really give all the parameters that I have and try to try to play around with the API here itself. So for example, I'm giving here to create a comment on the article, and I'm just having a test comment, and I executed the API, and here you see I got a response that okay, your comment has been created, and these are the details, and it got executed in 126 milliseconds. So everything is there, and we can have like really good look with the Swagger, and this makes our lives way easier. Yeah. With this, I would just like to give some recommendations, mostly focus on the testing part. There are some very good articles and blogs like from James Park, from Anna Murray about no rest for women, and from Katerina, and there was also a MOT 30-day challenge. So these are some very helpful sources about API designing and testing. So I really recommend all of them. And with this, I thank you all for being a wonderful audience, listening to me patiently. Thank you so much. You are a very wonderful audience. Questions? It can. Yes, we are doing it. Yeah, and you can also connect to the environments, and so we basically connect to the testing environments that we are running on, and we can actually see also on the UI. For example, I created a comment from here, and then I also see on the UI that the comment is there on the environment itself. Exactly, it does. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. True. Mm-hmm. True. True. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.